This is the third in a series about traveling for the 55 plus crowd. Once you clarify why you'd want to travel, as we discussed in a prior video, the question now becomes, where will I go? The following comparisons are in no certain order, but once you've decided on one versus the other, then the choice of where to go will come into focus. First, domestic versus international. Despite deciding between a domestic or an international trip often pivots on cost and ease of travel. It's just easier to travel in your own country, where culture, language, and currency and many other attributes are the same as in your hometown. Also, since you're aware of more options for such things as transportation and overnight accommodations, domestic travel will probably cost less. If the above is true for domestic travel, why would anyone want to have an international trip? For most people, the answer is because it's not home. International travelers seek something different than what's in their own backyard. There are sites, activities, and cultural attributes that they just are not available on a domestic trip. For example, if you want to see the Eiffel Tower, you need to go to France. And you also need to be willing to pay the cost for getting to France. That being said, here are some comparisons between domestic versus international travel. Travel documents. For domestic travel, you don't need a passport or other travel document, although during COVID, proof of vaccination was required in many cases. For international travel, a passport along with visa and your vaccination certificates usually are pretty much required. Then there's cost. Domestic travel is probably going to cost less, and international be more, but sometimes currency value differences can make some international travel destinations more affordable than you think. Then there's transportation. How do you get there? Well, if it's a domestic travel, you can drive your own vehicle. That's an option you can't use, though, in most cases for international travel. It's more likely you'll use air travel. And then once you get there, there's a lot of different options that might be depending on the country. For instance, in Europe, trains are a great way to travel between countries. Then there's the language barrier. Depending on where you're going, international travel may have some language barriers, whereas domestic travel, that's usually not a problem. Then there's cultural differences. Domestic travel, it's familiar culture, but you may be wanting to do some international traveling because there are new things to learn about other cultures. But this can also not only be rewarding, but it can be stressful too, because it's so different from what you're experienced at home. Then there's places to visit. Well, there's lots of places to visit in both places, international and at home. So really, they're pretty even on that case situation. But the international travel, as I mentioned before, will have some places you really can't get to in your own country. And then there's reservations. Making reservations should be easier in your own country. And since you're familiar with the way things work in your own culture, travelers may feel less confident about making international reservations. Then there comes down to, should you have a do-it-yourself vacation for planning or use a travel agency? Do-it-yourself traveling is more feasible at home because you're, again, familiar with the culture. But for international travel, your lack of knowledge and the distance away from home may make it a better choice for using a travel agency. Then there's trip length. If you're a domestic traveler, you're probably going to have a variety of options for making shorter trips. But if you go a long ways away for international travel, you may want to stay there for a while to make it worth your travel mile. And then there's communications. When you're at home, you can use your own cell phone and those kind of communication services. Whereas when you do travel overseas, you may need to make some special arrangements for mobile phone use. Electricity, no problem when you're in your own country. But if you go to other countries, you may need adapters to use the electricity there. As far as planning for a trip, a domestic trip probably takes less time because you really don't have as much risk involved. But planning for an international trip, it might make more sense to spend time at that because there's more contingencies to take into account when you're traveling in different cultures over longer distances. Then there's healthcare. If you're traveling in your own country, healthcare risks are probably a little more manageable and known. But if you're traveling overseas, you may want to do some more research into what you need to do to stay healthy when you're away from home. And then stress. Domestic trips will probably tend to be a little less stressful since travelers are more familiar with their own culture. International trips, on the other hand, may cause some more stress due to those cultural differences and the long distances involved. Of course, there are nuances to all the above comparisons. For example, U.S. citizens traveling to Canada will find fewer differences from home compared to a trip from the U.S. to Japan. Nevertheless, deciding on domestic versus international travel depends on how much cost and stress you're willing to endure to have the experiences you seek. Now, let's look at some other ideas on where you might go in your travels. Here's another comparison: urban versus rural. Travel is often motivated by desire to get away from the familiar by visiting a different kind of location. If you're a dweller of a hectic urban landscape, escaping to the tranquility of the country might be your objective. Conversely, rural residents may seek out the fast-paced excitement of big city life. Some travelers may want to experience a variety of locations. For example, you might be on a river cruise in Europe. That ship sails on the river through quiet country areas, but also docks at major cities so passengers can enjoy all the urban centers have to offer. Then, land versus water. Are you thinking of a trip on land versus water? As for land experiences, the variety is endless. So let's focus on water. The quintessential water voyage is a cruise. Large cruise ships today are floating resorts with an array of entertainments and other pleasures. Most make calls at ports where passengers can add land-based excursions. As an alternative to their wildly popular larger cousins, a number of smaller-scale cruise opportunities has been increasing. These generally are ships that carry less than 1,000 passengers, but most are well below that capacity. This type of cruise appeals to people who prefer less onboard congestion and the ability for the ship to dock at more varied ports of call. For example, river cruises have boomed in popularity. Also, some smaller vessels are equipped for more adventurous voyages, such as Antarctica. For an even closer to the water experience, some travelers charter sailboats. These trips can be with a hired crew, or there is often a bareboat option for those who have maritime credentials to captain a vessel. These trips lack the posh amenities of a big cruise ship, but they can provide a satisfying hands-on experience for once-in-a-while sailors. Then there's warm versus cold. Are you seeking a getaway to another climate? Cold weather motivates some to retreat to a warm, treacherous destination, while others flock to winter sports meccas for skiing or even ice fishing. Summer heat inspires some to seek cooler geographies. As climate change pushes summer temperatures to new records in some regions, traveling to beat the heat is liable to increase. Then there's resort versus tour. Suppose you'd prefer to avoid do-it-yourself vacation and opt instead for a more scripted experience of a resort or a tour. The difference between these two can be broadly defined by the amount of activity. A resort stay may tend to be more sedentary with a lot of relaxation time, with loads of food and drink. A popular resort option is an all-inclusive, where everything is included for one price. However, travelers need to do their homework before committing to an all-inclusive that they've never been to before. Check the details of what exactly is included and what is extra so you don't get surprised by additional costs. Also, some all-inclusives cut corners on the quality of food, beverages, and amenities. To avoid disappointment, check out the online reviews so that you know what to expect. On the other hand, a tour suggests movement from place to place. The transportation modes differ among tours depending on how much physical exertion is required. You could choose a luxury coach tour where you merely need to get on and off the bus, or opt for something more vigorous like a bike tour. Deciding on where to go may be easy for some who have a bucket list of places they want to visit. On the other hand, if that list is long, it may be difficult to pick the next best place. Knowing your priorities about location will help narrow down the list so that you can choose a great location for your travel experience. In the rest of this video series, we'll cover more things to think about as you plan your next travel adventure.